Well, hi everyone. We're going to talk about vision pathway coil, and we are Judy, Christina, Max, and Bryn. So, Christina and I are going to present the case of patient one. This person has lost the outputs from the eye, the retina, and the optic nerve are damaged, and we will interface at V1.
Well, now let's talk about the visual system overview. Here is the iris, the pupil, and the lens, but we're going to focus on the retina, which is the layer of tissue sensitive to light, and the optic nerve, which transfers visual information from the retina to the vision center of the brain.
So, the retina is made up of several layers. Among those layers, it is found the choroid, which is made up of a layer of blood vessels. The amacrine cell is for the regulation and integration of activity. The retinal pigment epithelium is a single layer of cells that provide essential nutrition. Then we have the photoreceptors, which are rows and cones, also the horizontal cells that increase the visual acuity. Moreover, the bipolar cells take the electrical information from the photoreceptor cells, and the ganglion cells are the cells that form the optic nerve.
So what happened to the damaged structures? In the case of the retina, the light cannot be processed. Also, it can affect your vision, and in some cases it can cause blindness. On the other hand, injury to the optic nerve generates a disconnection of the ganglion cells of the retina and axons from the rest of the brain and can be caused by an accident or a medical condition.
Okay, so we attempt to interface the retina structure, and our design will serve as a replacement for photoreceptors, which will stimulate the optic nerve and do the work that the photoreceptors are supposed to do. The image processing that we will implement will be able to interpret light signals obtained from the chip and the stimulation of the optic nerve, creating an artificial phototransduction process. The potential for sight recovery we hope for is the brain to be able to obtain the ability to transform information and interpret images. Some limitations are whether the visual quality is the same or good enough. Also, the research is limited, so it will take some time to improve it in humans. This chip would be placed through surgery, stimulating the optic nerve and allowing the image to go through the thalamus and reach the geniculate nucleus up to the V1 cortex.
Finally, this is a drawing of our design, which indicates the four principal parts of the prosthetic. The chip will contain the electrodes responsible for stimulating the optic nerve, which will be implanted behind the retina and will connect the missing layer, sending electrical impulses in order to complete the vision process. It will be activated after several weeks through a manual activation or like a remote control. Then the intensity of the electrodes will be adjusted through a specialized laser that controls it. And that's it. Max will explain the case of patient 2.
Right, so patient 2 has damage to their primary visual area. They're not going to be having any information flowing through their visual cortex, so we're going to have to interface before and after area V1. So a quick overview of the visual cortex. Information from light flows from the retina to the visual pathway through the lateral geniculate nucleus and then through the optic radiation to primary visual area V1 to the rest of the extrastriate cortex. The function of the striate cortex is to pass information from the LGN to the rest of the extrastriate cortex. It has selective neurons for object recognition, so it's crucial for the early steps of object recognition and simple recognition. The neurons in the striate cortex have a retinotopic organization, which means they have a mapping that's similar to the organization of the mapping of the retinal map. Damage to the striate cortex means that there's going to be no information transferring from the axons and the optic radiation. And that means the patient is going to perceive no color. They're not going to be able to perceive movement, and they won't be able to recognize objects. There's going to be a lack of stimulus throughout the visual cortex. And most patients will experience blind sight, which is where they'll respond to a visual stimulus, but they won't actually be able to perceive it in their visual field. So our prosthetic is going to connect to the optic radiation axons in the calcarine fissure. It's going to send that information from those axons to V2 and V4. It's going to have a processing unit that has simple nodes that will read electrical impulses, and it'll perform a selection for relevant impulses, and then it'll send the efferent impulses to the extrastriate cortex, which is areas V2 through V5. It'll also be able to take feedback impulses from those areas and send feedback impulses to the lateral geniculate nucleus. In terms of recovery, we hope that the patient will have a full recovery to their motion and color vision, and that they'll be able to recognize objects, and no longer experience blind sight. The limits of our implant is that it would need to be able to read visual stimuli in a way that isn't currently possible and weed out irrelevant information.
All right, so for patient 3, they have damage to their V1, which is the primary visual cortex, their V4, and their MT. The V1 is what's responsible for the conscious processing of visual stimuli, and it contains a complete map of the visual field covered by the eye. The V4 is thought to be where our color experiences are processed and shapes are recognized, and the MT is an essential part of perceiving motion and guiding eye movements in the brain. So our system is we wanted to design a structure almost like eyeglasses with an implanted chip, and it also has a visual processing unit worn on the waist. It comes in 5 parts. The first is a camera, which physically acquires and stores the surrounding visual stimuli. The second is the visual processing unit worn on the waist, and it sends wireless electrical signals to the chip that's implanted on the side of the head. This implanted chip is what processes information that's collected by the camera in that visual processing unit, and then it sends a series of electrical impulses to an LED array. This LED array is what creates a desired pattern of distribution of light, and it directs it onto an optic lens. And this lens is where all collected information about the visual stimuli will be projected onto the eye. And our goals for patient 3, the first is to restore image obtaining and processing functions that were lost by the lack of the V1, bring back basic shapes and minimal color recognition that was lost by the lack of the V4, restore the patient's ability to perceive objects in motion, which will compensate for the lack of the MT. And ultimately, we want our headset to help patient 3 navigate their surroundings, see basic shapes on things like TV and smartphones, and most importantly, hopefully be able to recognize faces.